is a recent IELTS Writing Task 1 question, and it was asked on 27th of November 2023. So the table gives information about the salaries of secondary high school teachers in 5 countries in 2009. Summarize and report the main features of the given visual. So this is the question. We are talking about the secondary / high school teachers and their salaries, how they have increased, how are they differing in 5 different countries that we're talking about, what are the years taken. So before we come to the table itself, let's understand the division of timing or the planning that you have to do before you start writing. So as we have discussed again and again, that your writing task or the writing task in IELTS exam has 2 tasks for you. There is a task 1 and there is task 2. Writing task 1, that one we're doing is a report, and writing task 2 is an essay. Now to attempt both of these tasks, you are given 1 hour. So how do we divide this time? I suggest my students to give 20 minutes to your task 1 and 40 minutes to your task 2. That is the suggested or recommended time division. Because in essay you have to write at least 250 words, whereas report you have to write at least 150 words. So according to the word limit and according to the intensity or the complexity of the task, the students find it best to divide 40 minutes to their essay and then 20 minutes to report. It's not that one carries more weightage than the other. It's just that in essay, there's a more involved thought process in planning the points that you have to write, but whereas report is pretty straightforward as compared to an essay. So that's why you can complete it in 20 minutes or sooner. But that should be the target, to complete it in at least 20 minutes. Don't take any more than that, because then you won't have any time for your task too. Now, what is the ideal word limit? This is very important again. So ideal word limit. Now, there is no set that word limit that has been given to us by the examiners that you have to write exactly this number of words, but you are supposed to write at least 150 words. That means you cannot write 149 words. It will be marked negatively. When I say at least 150 words means more than 150 words or 150 words at the very least. Now, you can also, the optimal word limit that we suggest to students is 180 words or 190 words. This is this word limit you should play with. So while you're practicing your task one, you make sure that when you're writing, you understand how many words are you encompassing. So this will give you a rough idea that in one line, let's say you, in one particular line, you write about 10 words. So if you're writing 15 lines, that means you have written 150 words, a roundabout idea. If you, of course, give a computer-based test, you can get the word numbers down there. But if you're giving a paper-based test, this is how you can build your speed. But even in a computer-based test, you need to make sure that you have this idea in your head that if I'm going to write this much, it will get along to these words so that you can write accordingly in your task one. But do not exceed 200 words, because then it will be too wordy, and too wordy texts are not liked by examiners at all. We're supposed to be concise, clear, and brief the information. We're not there to just replicate the details that are given to us. We're supposed to give them an inference in concise and crisp words that tells that we have a good command over the language. Moving on. So now let's study this table that we are given here. So the table has, number 1, countries. So what countries are there? There's Australia, Denmark, Luxembourg, Korea, Japan. Next, we have starting salaries of these individuals in the year 2009. That what were they starting with? So when they first got there, what was their starting salary? Then according to US dollar, what is their salary per year? And what is the maximum salary they can get to? All right. So, and what was the years that took them to reach the top salary? So this was a survey done in 2009, where we saw that different people from different countries and the average number of years that it took them to reach the highest or the maximum salary in their particular given country. So now that's the data. Now, before I move on to this data, what we can see, are there any patterns that you can recognize or any main features? So what are main features? I always tell my students it's just high and low figures. So if we can recognize any higher or low figures, then we're going to go about it. So if you see here, we can see that Korea and Japan have lowest figures basically. They come into the bottom 2. Then the highest starting salary is enjoyed by Luxembourg. And then we come to the salary per year. Highest is again Luxembourg. Even in the maximum salary, highest remains to be Luxembourg. So that is one highlight feature, that Luxembourg remains the highest, gets the highest, people in Luxembourg the highest starting salary, and even the maximum salary is greater than the rest of the countries. Now, if we talk about maximum salaries, so we can see that Korea, despite starting at the lowest rung of the salary, still maintains to get into 84,000, while the other salaries, the lowest maximum salary is seen in Australia. That is one thing that we have noticed here. So there's no inference right now we are making, we're just highlighting the main features. So do not worry about the other things, just focus on the high and low parts. Then when we're talking about years taken to reach top salary, so the lowest is in Denmark, Australia even, and the highest is in Korea. So see, even though Korea is reaching a greater maximum salary than other countries, it is taking the highest number of years. So see how this, I'm making inferences here. I'm not just reading out the data because anybody can do that. I have kept on repeating this in multiple sessions that anybody can go ahead and write down, replicate this data that Australia had this much starting salary. In 9 years, they reached to 48,000 and Korea had the lowest salary in 30,000. But the inference is that Korea had the lower salary, but it got to a higher salary than the other countries, but it took them 37 years. That was the highest amount of time. So these are the inferences that we make. And again, these inferences are very subjective, but sometimes I might notice a different thing and you might notice a different pattern that's going on. Most of the times, of course, highest and lowest values will be the same, but the inference that you make from this data could be very subjective. So you don't hesitate to go ahead and make inferences on your own and make sure that they're fact-checked. Your numbers and figures are correlating your inferences. So let's move on to the first body paragraph. So the first paragraph is simply going to be, we're going to paraphrase this question. So the question that is given to us, let's paraphrase this. What do I mean by paraphrase? Rewrite in words that it doesn't look like you have just copy pasted the question. So we are writing here, the table presents data on emoluments. That's the word we have used here for salaries. So that's a synonym. If you're not sure of the words emoluments, you can use other words. For example, remuneration. There are other words, annual salaries or whatever. You can go ahead, any synonym that you use. But make sure if you're using a synonym or a higher fancy word, you know the exact meaning of it. Do not just go ahead and use a word that you do not know the meaning of, but it looks better than the others. So whenever using a better vocabulary, make sure that you know the exact meaning of it. Otherwise, you'll be negatively marked in the memorized word section. That is in the IELTS section. IELTS. Next, in 5 nations. Now, since there are just 5 nations, so I can go ahead and name them. If these nations, let's say, if I have around 10 nations or 12 nations, then I definitely cannot write them all. But if there are less than 7 around that figure, I can go ahead and put them in these brackets in 2009. If you want, you can also add that the figures are represented in dollars. So you can definitely mention, do not the sign, but you can write that it is mentioned in dollars. So whatever the unit has been taken, for example, if they have given you the percentage and what the number of years, so you can go ahead and mention that also, that the figure represents the salaries in dollars as well as the years taken to reach the maximum salary. So here we have simply paraphrased the question. Let's move on to the overall passage. Now for the overall passage, here, remember what the highest, lowest figures that we were talking about, here those matter. So here we'll be talking about the highest and lowest figures. But before I start the overall, just remember in overall, just a minute. In overall, no data is to be mentioned. And when I say no data, that means no figures. I can write it had the highest value, but I cannot write the value. The highest value was, let's say, 139 or 139,000. I cannot write the figure. I can only mention that it was the highest. So remember that in overall, no data is to be mentioned. So let's have a read. So we started our paragraph with overall. Luxembourg offered the highest maximum salary. So you see, we talked about this. Luxembourg had the highest salary, while Australia had the lowest. So who had the lowest? Australia had the lowest salary. So we're talking about in terms of maximum salaries. The time required to reach the top salary varied across countries, with Denmark and Australia having shorter durations compared to Korea, which took the longest. So Korea took the longest, whereas Denmark and Australia had the shorter values. So see, we talked about these figures in this beginning. So this is how we can write our overall. So these are the things you can mention in your overall. We mentioned the maximum salary was the highest in Luxembourg and the lowest in Australia, whereas the years taken maximum were in Korea and there were lower years in Australia and Denmark. Just the overall figures, the main features that strike out to us on the very first look. It could be these figures, or you could also talk about starting figures. That's completely, as I said, is subjective to individual's choice. But as you can see, I did not mention any figure here. I did not mention that it took them 37 years. I only mentioned it took them the highest time, because that all will be done in the body paragraphs. Now, when coming to the body paragraphs, you also need to realize how you're going to divide data. So when I say divide data, that you have 5 categories here, right? So how are you going to write about these 5 categories in a way that you can split the data in 2 body paragraphs? So what I did here, what I personally like to do is, I take similar values in one paragraph and choose the other ones. For example, if you can see, Australia, Denmark had the higher values in terms of starting and maximum salaries, whereas Korea started off with lower salaries, Korea and Japan, right? So I clubbed Korea and Japan in body paragraph 2 and body paragraph 1 I used for these. But you can also go ahead and talk about Luxembourg and Korea in the first paragraph so that you can compare a contrast. You can create a contrast between them, that Luxembourg started with the highest, Korea started with the lowest. That's also definitely fine. But that categorization depends completely upon you, how you choose to group the data together. So that's why, but it is the easiest way to go is like club 3 things that have a similar pattern together and the other 2 in the other body paragraph. So see, Luxembourgers, the people who live in Luxembourg, enjoy the highest starting salary at 80,000, surpassing even maximum salaries in Australia, Denmark, and Japan. So I mentioned the values here. However, the salary progression in Luxembourg, taking 30 years to reach 139, contrasts sharply with Australia and Denmark, where teachers reach their maximum salaries in relatively shorter periods of 9 to 8 years, respectively. Right? So see, we don't have to mention all of this data that we are given here, just the inference, the major inferences that what we are talking about here, that Luxembourg enjoyed the highest starting salary and it even enjoyed the highest maximum salary. However, it took them 30 years as compared to the 9 and 8 years in the other countries that, even though started at a lower rung, took fairly less time to get to their highest points. Now, this is the comparison we made for first body paragraph. Let's move on to the second body paragraph, which is, now see, on the other hand, now we're going to talk about the lower rung, or the countries that started with the lower maximum salaries. See, on the other hand, that is the linker we have used here, both Korea and Japan started with lower salaries. How much? 3,500 and 28,000 respectively. Interestingly, Korean teachers, despite their low starting point, eventually reached a higher maximum salary than Japanese counterparts. So now, even eventually, that they have had higher salaries than their Japanese counterparts. Korea required 37 years to reach 84,500, whereas Japan reached 62,400 in 34 years. So that is the major comparisons that we have drawn here. So let's have a look at the whole task in one slide. So you can see it starts with the phrasing, the paraphrasing, the question, writing it in your own language, the overall, that starts with writing overall so that the examiner must also know that you're writing the overall. Some students prefer to write overall in the last, after 2 body paragraphs, but I suggest to students to write it in the second body paragraph, because even if sometimes students run out of time, the overall is still there, so you can at least bag those scores. Overall is an important part of your task 1. So if there might be any confusion with conflicting resources, this is something I wanted to clear with you once. Then body paragraph 1 and body paragraph 2. Body paragraph 1, we talked about Luxembourg, Australia, and Denmark in detail. Body paragraph 2, we talked about Korea and Japan in their detail because they had the lower starting salaries. All right. Now, apart from these, what are the other things that we need to focus upon? So there are 4 criterias. As if you open the IELTS criteria assessment sheet, you must see task assessment, grammatical range and accuracy, coherence and cohesion, and lexical resource. Task assessment, did you summarize the information? Yes, we did. We did not just write lengthy paragraphs. Did we compare the information? Did we make comparisons here? Yes, we did. When we were comparing Korea and Japan, low starting point but higher counterparts, then 30 years it took in Luxembourg, whereas in teachers reached their maximum salaries in a relatively shorter period. So just relatively shorter periods. This is how we have compared the data. Did we highlight the main features? Yes, in the overall, we did that which took the longest, which had the highest maximum salary. So task achievement, done. Grammatical range and accuracy. Okay, before that, let's come to the lexical resource. Lexical resource is nothing but just a fancy way of saying your vocabulary. So did we use higher vocabulary words? Yes, we used emoluments, and then we used words like durations, shorter durations compared, because we did not just say that it took less time, we compared it to the other words and used shorter durations. Then the word like surpassing, that means growing across or even crossing the maximum values of the other countries. Then we used relatively shorter. Then we have respectively also, we use respectively when you are talking about 2 figures. Respectively means the first figure associates to first country, the second figure associates to second country. So that is one question I get asked a lot, that why do we use respectively when you are writing figures and you've written them in order and you have to correlate them with another kind of units, then you can write respectively, which are in the same. Then despite their low starting point, eventually means over the time. Now, if I had written quickly, that would have meant in less years, let's say 7 years, 8 years. But when I'm writing eventually, or if I'm writing gradually, that means very slow period, slow movement over the period of time. So it was 37 years. That's why I've written gradually and eventually. So these minor differences between the words and the categories and their values tells a lot to the examiner that how much grasp do you have over the language. All right. So that is your lexical resource. Grammatical range and accuracy. Grammatical accuracy means you have to be accurate in your grammar. Your subject verb agreements, your tenses, and punctuation all should be correct. But apart from them, when I talk about grammatical range, then what is that? Let me just clear out my drawings as well so that we can have a clearer screen. Yes. So when we are talking about grammatical range, what are we saying? So when we say grammatical range, I mean complex sentences. I mean compound sentences, passive statements. And generally the report is written in a passive form because it's a report. So you cannot use active sentences that who did what. So we use passive sentences. Those kind of things make for a good report. For example, let's have a look at this. Overall, Luxembourg offered the highest maximum salary. Independent clause. While Australia had the lowest. Dependent clause. Now, this clause is dependent on this clause to make complete sense. I can just write Luxembourg offered the highest maximum salary and full stop. But can I write while Australia had the lowest? Because it won't make sense. What while? What lowest? When I combine one independent and dependent clause, I make a complex sentence and I show the examiner that I have a grasp over the different types of sentence structures in English. Then even here in this sentence, the time required to reach the top salary varied across countries, independent clause, with Denmark and Australia having shorter durations compared to Korea, dependent clause, because this doesn't make sense independently, which took the longest is because we took a break in it and put a comma. subclause in between. So that is how we are making a compound complex sentence. So these are the things that you have to use in your essays and reports to show the examiner that you have a grasp over different kinds of sentence structures. And also when we talk about tenses, use different kinds of tenses. So here, since we are talking about 2009, we'll be talking in past only, right? So how we have used enjoyed, then reached, started. So we have talked everything about in past. So that is also very crucial that you fathom the time period, the things that the data has been, that data is talking about. Last but not the least, coherence and cohesion. So when I say coherence and cohesion, is the flow of your data. That is it a very cohesive post that you're making that you can see that from where you're moving from one place to another, or is it just a cluster of multiple sentences thrown together? So when we use coherence, when we assess coherence and cohesion, we see things like linkers, overall, on the other hand, then however, for contrast, then we have um, whereas there was while somewhere here. Yes. So these are all the sort of linkers you can use and make sure that your data is presenting a cohesive story. That if I'm talking about Korea and Japan here, so then I'm only talking about Korea and Japan in the next sentences. And if I have to switch, then I use some sort of linker that however, or there's something else going on here. So that is how you make sure that cohesion is there in your task one. All right. So that's all for today. So quick tips just to remember the things that we have already talked about. Use linkers. Moreover, however, on the contrary, it gives a good structure to your task one report as well as shows a better vocabulary holding also. Spellings and punctuation, be very careful. For example, if the state that was given us to Luxembourg, make sure that whatever the name is given to you, if it's a country, if it's a city, you spell it properly because a lot of times these countries you might not know their names. So if you are copying data from there, from the table, make sure that the spellings you're using are correct. Take care of grammar, as we've already discussed, your punctuation, subject verb agreement, everything. Cover all the requirements. We did talk about these, summarize, compare, highlight, then compare the data. It is very important to not just write the data. It was 34,000 in 2009 and so on. Compare the data that it was the highest and it felt lowest. It slightly increased, it gradually increased, moderately increased. Use find out all these words. What do they mean? How do they differ from each other? What just search how moderately is different from exponentially or how exponential is different from gradual. What is the difference between two words? When do I use them? How do I compare the data if there one thing is changing in 37 years and the other thing is changing in 9 years? So which one is exponential, which one is gradual, which one is quick, and which one is slow? So those are all the things that you have to compare while writing your report, but make inference before you start writing. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining. For more such IELTS interactive sessions and content, please follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube channel. Here are your handles. And if you want access to some of the IELTS material, resources, or any kind of crash course or comprehensive course that you want in IELTS to prepare for your IELTS exam, please visit our website www.yunolearning.com. We have been meticulously creating a resource site for all the students and which are thoroughly reviewed and checked by our team. If you have any other inquiries, please call us at this number. And if you have anything that you want to add or that you want us to focus on in the next session, please drop below the comments so that we can also get it for you done and make sure that you are also engaged with us.